Welcome, friends. I am so glad that you are all here. I'm joining you tonight from the shared ancestral and unceded territories of the Hunkaminam and Squamish speaking people in what is now called Burnaby, BC. And as is often our tradition in United Church Zoom calls, I invite you to add where you're joining from this evening into the chat if you're feeling so called. I'm really, really thrilled, especially now that I've read the book, to have Dr. Jeffrey Wilkinson and Raja Khouri joining us tonight to talk about their book, The Wall Between. I came to know Raja because he is a longtime friend and colleague of the Reverend Dr. Karen Hamilton, a United Church minister whom many of you know was the General Secretary of the Canadian Council of Churches for years and years, and has also been involved in interfaith dialogue, ecumenical dialogue, and direct advocacy for peace in the Holy Land, and is involved still with Raja through the Rosanna Project. So Karen had connected me with Raja, and we were talking about my call as newly elected moderator of the United Church, and then he mentioned that this book was coming out that he had written with his friend Jeffrey, and I said, wow, I'm going to have this book club that I'm starting as part of my time of connecting with folks across the church, and there are so many dedicated people across the United Church of Canada who care so deeply because you have traveled as religious pilgrims to Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories, because you have worked as ecumenical accompagnators for peace in Palestine and Israel with the World Council of Churches, because you have interfaith relationships here in Canada and in the Holy Land. And it is also been the source of a lot of conflict within our church and straining our relationships with interfaith partners here in Canada. And so I'm really interested in the approach that Jeffrey and Raja took together, and excited for you both to be here. I won't say a ton more than what's on their bios on the back of their book, but Raja is CEO of Khouri Conversations, a human rights and inclusion consultant, the founding president of the Canadian Arab Institute, and board member at Project Rosanna in Canada, and a former 10-year commissioner with the Ontario Human Rights Commission. He's a Canada Committee member of Human Rights Watch and co-founder of the Canadian Arab Jewish Leadership Dialogue Group. And Jeffrey Wilkinson, PhD, is an American Jew who lives in Canada. He holds a doctorate in education from the University of Toronto and works actively in the Jewish community and beyond on issues relating to trauma and the Israel-Palestine struggle. Jeff's partnership with Raja, born out of deep listening and learning together, has become central to his work. And so welcome to both of you.
Thank you very much, Carmen.
Thank you for having me, Carmen. I remember when we had our first chat, about 10 minutes in, you mentioned the book club, and you said, oh, this might be good for the book club. And then about 20 minutes in, you asked me, are you available on November 30th at 6:30 p.m.? Yeah, it didn't take long for you to realize I guess the importance of this work, and of course for us, the United Church is a perfect audience, because they are very interested in the subject. They're interested in justice and human rights in Palestine, Israel. And these are exactly the values that motivated us to do this work.
Yeah. So the reason why I chose tonight was because I wanted it to be soon, and also I think your book was released on like September 30th or was it September 30th or August?
October 1st.
October 1st. And so having a book club, having you joined the October 21st or October 24th, whenever it was, the October book club meeting, seemed really challenging just in terms of people being able to access the book. And so, and I know still, I think your book sold out from several distributors right away. And so I know that there are folks who may not have finished reading your book because it took a while to get it. Many of our readers are also active patrons of their local libraries, and lots of libraries hadn't yet had a chance to do it. And so I'm really grateful that you're also allowing us to record this session, because it will live in our online learning platform, ChurchX. And so folks who may want to use this video as a resource later with their communities of faith, or come back and rewatch it after they've finished the book. Grateful for that as well. So your book came out 6 days before the attacks that sparked the new round of violence that is happening there now. How are you both doing? I've seen so many friends, both Palestinians and Jews in the diaspora, saying, just ask us how we're doing. So I'm going to start there and say, how are you both doing? It's a difficult time.
Jeff, please go ahead.
Oh, I was waiting for you. I mean, we have had pretty much every day, we've had a conversation that begins with, I'm not doing well. And this is the trust that we have with each other. We don't pretend. I mean, I can speak from my perspective. I am buoyed and touched and honored that our work, has been able to reach a lot of people. And that, of course, is, has a certain excitement. But for the most part, I'm going through the phases of grief. I feel the tremendous loss of life. I feel the Jewish community's deep-seated fear. I have lost, some close friends and colleagues since October 7th because of who we are and the stand that I take. And that's certainly been painful. And, I'm in pain because I watch the values that we supposedly support in the West be continually ignored by our leadership. And that's very painful for me.
Yeah, I mean, one challenge for me, and it's probably the first time that I was able to sort of meet that challenge, is to have empathy for the lives lost on October 7th. It's hard for a Palestinian to empathize with Israeli losses because of the magnitude of losses that the Palestinians have had to endure since 1975. Sorry, since 1948, 75 years ago. And one of the things we talk about in the book is, the two meta-narratives, the two traumas that motivate reactions by Palestinians and Jews, and those being, for Jews, of course, it's the Holocaust, and for Palestinians, it's the Nakba. So, every time something happens in Israel, Palestine, for a Palestinian, the memory goes back to 1948. We trace the pain that started in 1948, and then it never ended, and it continues to this day with the ongoing dispossession of Palestinians in the West Bank and of course Gaza, the flattening of Gaza. So, but having said that, because of the many years of dialogue I've had with Jewish colleagues, and because of my close relationship with Jeff, and him sharing with me what he was going through and what his community was going through, I was able to gather the empathy for the Israeli losses on October 7th. And, it may not sound like much. It may sound like, how could you not have empathy? But that's how trauma works. You need your own trauma to be recognized before you cannot recognize the other's trauma. And that's another thing I learned from Jeff. I sometimes call him Dr. Trauma. He's the trauma expert. Correct me if I'm saying anything wrong, Jeff.
You're doing great, buddy.
I'm doing great. So yeah, that's my story here.
So there's no way that you could have predicted that so soon after the launch of your book that we'd be in this situation with just the unimaginable loss of life, both the initial attacks and how violent and directed at civilians they were, and also I think even for those of us who have been engaged in paying attention to the outsized use of force and power, I will say, on behalf of the state of Israel as an occupying military power, like it's, I mean, I cannot even find the words to describe how writ large the dehumanization of Palestinians in Gaza is and in the West Bank. And so what has the response been to your book when we're at such a heightened time? Like I kept finding when I was reading it, I would say like, okay, if we were in a period of relative calm, I can see that how this has happened. But I also know from, the intergenerational trauma and both my parents have PTSD from their childhood histories. I'm, I don't think you can grow up Indigenous in Canada without carrying intergenerational trauma, plus my own traumas as a child. And I know that like when you're triggered into that space that you talk about in the book of like the trauma is re-happening again now in your body, that it's also not the time to say, okay, like let's take a step back and talk about this rationally. And so I imagine that in some ways your work has become so much more important, but also so much more difficult.
Go ahead.
I think that's a very fair statement, Carmen. So, I mean, the interesting thing that has happened is we often say that our communities, the Palestinian and Jewish communities, are in their corners, are licking their wounds, are acting out of fear and fright. Yet the observer communities have been deeply interested. We have drawn crowds to events that we had never, ever imagined. We've sold out movie theaters. We've had 270 on a call. We've had, it's just been crazy. But the vast majority are either Jews and Palestinians who are already doing this work or outside observers, people of faith from various groups, some non-people of faith, but people who are social justice minded or interested, even people who know very, very little about the conflict and had not even been interested in it, earlier before October 7th, I think have really wanted to ask why it, what is this? And even before October 7th, I think one of the most things we constantly shake our head about is why is the subject of this relatively small space, many thousands of miles away, such a dominant narrative and conversation here in North America? And it's a complex set of answers, but it does often shock us how much space it takes up here.
It's interesting, Carmen, and you read the book. Of course, the book was written way before October 7th, but everything in it was prophetic about how people react, and they followed the steps as described in the book. The dialogue broke down. I tried with one dialogue partner who's been a friend, a dear friend for many years, who is Jewish, and within minutes, it broke down. The passions were very high, emotions are very high, the fear is high, the frustration is high, and you cannot dialogue in these kind of conditions. I mean, one primary rule for dialogue is that you listen to understand, and not you don't listen to respond and prove the other person wrong and score points. You want to understand the other. But when you're angry, when you're emotional, the ability to listen to understand is greatly diminished, and it's not time for dialogue.
Mhm. I think I sent you the letter, that the joint letter that their National Indigenous Council and General Council Executive recently wrote to the Prime Minister, sort of following suit from the UN, that, you know, four or five of the criteria for genocide are believed to be being met, or there's evidence that they're being met. And so I had a Jewish friend say, now that you signed a letter accusing Israel of genocide, that makes me a supporter of the worst crime possible. I don't think I can continue this relationship. And you know, I'm the signatory on the letter, and so this was my response. I do believe there's evidence of genocide. I don't believe you support genocide, and I believe it's possible to support Israel without supporting genocide. I do believe Israel is acting outside of the law, and that doesn't mean I think that you support genocide. If you want to end our relationship with me, that's your choice. I'm not accusing you of anything, and I'm not choosing to walk away from dialogue, and I will still be here when you want to circle back one day. And that was like the only thing that I could think to say in that moment, because I know that, and I feel like I hadn't quite finished reading the book, and it was really the latter half of the book where I really started to deeply understand the connections between the experience of the Holocaust and like seeing Israel as, I guess, the
Safety blanket.
safety blanket, or like, I guess the commitment to the prevention of a future Holocaust, right? And that was really helpful for me in a way that I didn't anticipate. Like it sort of humanized for me the Canadian Jewish attachment to the state of Israel in a way that was really helpful.
Absolutely. And if I can add a little bit to it, I mean, so I can think of three terms that are especially triggering in accusations of Israel. One is genocide, one is apartheid, and the other is settler colonialism. And it isn't hard if you are deeply schooled, in anti-oppression frameworks to be able to handle these. But for most of my community, I can tell you that they are deeply upsetting and triggering terms. And primarily because it is seen as a way to delegitimize their right to be safe. So when you say to a Jew whose psychological makeup, our psychological makeup for 2,000 plus years has been as victims, and you're viewing who we are, you know, as victimizers. So I often say that the core Jewish schism that we are dealing with on a psychosocial level, you know, the Jews as a people, as a group. So, if you can imagine, we have sort of one collective brain, and obviously we're not all the same, but if you just kind of imagine that for a minute, our collective brain cannot hold these two things together. That we have been an oppressed group, we still are in many ways an oppressed group, and we are also oppressors. So terms like apartheid, settler colonialism, and genocide remind Jews of the oppressor label. And most Jews, many, see this as a really delegitimizing of what it means to care about the only place in the world that many Jews feel, you know, even if it's a romantic notion, that they are safe. Our Jewish friends will often say to us that every time we've left it up to somebody else, it hasn't gone well for us. So these terms like genocide really hit home. And, I want to frame very clearly that legally, I think we're all on solid ground to use all three of the terms. But if you're really going to enter into a deep relationship with someone, you have to be able to see how their emotional brain handles what you're saying and have empathy for that, rather than try to prove that your point is correct.
Yeah, I mean, I avoided for the longest time, for many years, the use of the word apartheid in my, dialogue with Jewish colleagues, because it's a trigger, because it puts people on the defensive, and because you end up arguing about whether it's apartheid or not. And I'd rather get to the substance of, daily realities and, how do we get out of this mess? But then, last year, when a number of human rights organizations around the world and in Israel all came out and said, it's apartheid. And that's when I went to my Jewish friends and I said, okay, I mean, we've avoided this a long time, but what if it is apartheid? Do you want to continue to deny it, or do you want to accept that there's a problem here that needs to be fixed? And it didn't go down very well. People continued to be, defensive. Some people who are more moderate said, well, yeah, it's apartheid in the West Bank and Gaza, but it's not in Israel itself. Fine, I mean, if you want to make that distinction, but I mean, who's governing the West Bank and Gaza? Who's controlling them? It's Israel. It's the Israeli government. It's still apartheid, practiced by the Israeli government. And unfortunately, the propaganda machines, very effective machines, well-oiled, well-staffed. They spin everything, and they take something like, you're talking about apartheid, and that means you want to destroy Israel, and therefore you're anti-Semitic, and you're no good. We're not going to talk to you. So I know we're probably getting to this part later in the session today, but this, and I got to understand in my work with Jeff, I got to understand why this defensiveness is coming from, and the fear and the trauma, and how, and it's also generational. If you look at it, I mean, we have now many young Jews here, but more so in the United States, who are sort of 2 generations away from the Holocaust and are not as committed to the sort of Zionist ideal as their parents, and are looking at the situation from a justice lens, from a Black Lives Matter, from indigenous rights, from Me Too. All of those things are saying, something is wrong with this picture. We cannot stand behind Israel when it's doing this to Palestinians. And I often say to people, I remind Palestinians all the time that the best advocates for Palestinian human rights in North America have been Jews. Mm-hmm. So it is not so much, a Jewish thing as it is a Zionist thing and a trauma thing. And a Zionist thing comes with the party line, with the tribal thinking, with the tribal ideology that kind of keeps people in place.
Yeah. I guess for me, in the conversations that I've had as a church leader, I think probably Raja, but I don't think Jeffrey knows, and maybe a lot of our participants don't know, that when I served on the governing bodies of the World Council of Churches from 2006 to 2013, a victim of my own advocacy for the fact that Indigenous people don't just care about the environment, I ended up co-chairing the Palestine-Israel Ecumenical Forum core group of the World Council of Churches for a few years. And I was sort of posing a hypothetical question to the board and said, like, why are you always just asking Indigenous people to talk about the environment? What if we have something to say about nuclear disarmament? What if we have something to say about Israel-Palestine? And then they were like, here, come chair this really fraught conversation. And so I feel caught between, like, in the United Church, we have a long-standing practice of speaking when our partners ask us to speak, and in the way that our partners ask us to speak, in a way that is generally, I think, a good principled approach to things, because we're centering those that are on the margins of power. And that is in part the church's living amends for legacies, like centuries of colonization and genocide in our tradition. And I think, like, your book made me question that approach, because if our partners are stuck in their corner, as you say, and they're living out of this, narrative that's deeply based in their trauma, then maybe the advocacy that we take out of that commitment, like, is it effective? And if it's not, like, but then how do you have a trauma-informed approach to say, like, as outsiders, we don't think that's effective, and why don't we try this instead? Like, that seems hard. And then at the same time, when we're trying to have like Jewish Christian dialogue, and then you have somebody like, I think, many of the folks at CJA would say that they're pro-Palestinian Zionists, and I think, how does that work? And can we have a conversation about what that means? Like, and I, to this date, have not been able to have that conversation about what that means, right? So like, as an outsider, what's the highest and best use of our time and advocacy as a church?
Well, that's quite a question, Carmen. I'm just going to kind of back up, as I always do, to how trauma works, how the brain works, how we think. So we are in many ways programmed to binary thinking. So that means that we have lovely ideals, for instance, about community. And so when you say your partners, so the people that are in, but I have said for years that community is a lovely thing, and it's also a very clear form of othering. To have an us, you have to have a them. So how do you frame rights, dignity, respect, caring for each human life the same, without this sort of binary of, I'm going to kind of side with this over here and not this over here? Part two is that I always start with my Jewish community to say that if your concern is only for safety for Jews, I'm good. Because the only way to create safety for Jews is to solve the Palestinian question. The only way. You cannot, as we have seen again, you cannot fight or kill your way out of this situation. You can't force and oppress people to stop resisting you. It is not possible. And so we keep being given as Jews false binary choices. You either protect Israel or you're in favor of anti-Semitism and the loss of Jewish safety. These are the wrong answers to the wrong questions. The question is, do you see that Palestinian and Jewish safety are intertwined? Do you see that Palestinian rights and Jewish rights are intertwined? Do you see that pain is pain, that there's no hierarchy of trauma? And as long as both groups are suffering, their ability to solve problems is going to be greatly diminished. So the way forward is to remove the suffering, or as much as possible. What Raja has told me over and over again is, what we want is for you to get your knee off our neck. So that's where I start. And the second part is, as I often say in our talks, the breaking point for me, and I've been to Israel and loved and had that Jewish warm reaction. The breaking point for me was when I started to grapple with what I gained, he lost. Mm-hmm. That's incompatible not only with my humanity, but with my Judaism.
Yeah, I mean, the main reason we wrote this book is to promote understanding between two groups who, at best, don't know much about each other. At worst, they hate each other, are each other's throats, and uninterested in learning about the other, as the book's name suggests. But it's essential because, and I'll give an example. I mean, until I started talking to Jews, I had never heard Zionism being described as a movement for self-determination.
Mhm.
To me, Zionism was the force that destroyed Palestinian society, that forced my parents to leave their homes and everything behind, and has since continued to take over more and more of my land. It's a destructive force. For Palestinians, Zionism is a dirty word. So I learned from talking to Jews what Zionism is to them. So they support Zionism, Israel particularly, not because they hate me or they don't care about me, but because it's important to them to feel safe and have self-determination. And they, in turn, my Jewish colleagues, learned from me that everything that Zionism gave to them, it took away from me. And for the last 75 years, these two peoples have been trying to share this land unsuccessfully. And the imbalance of power has prevented there being a just solution that gives each people what they need or their minimum needs. We often hear accusations thrown around, we don't have a partner for peace, you rejected every offer. That's all nonsense. If the offers have been good, if the offer had been just, people would accept it. So, are we going to go on for 75 more years killing each other and fearing each other and, having this enmity until we figure out how we're going to share this land? Every person who dies today, tomorrow, and the day after is a useless death, because until we share this land, we're going to go on killing each other. And we ought to learn 75 years later that, we've been doing it wrong. There has to be a different way that we can relate to each other and agree that we are really intertwined. It's a small piece of land, and these two peoples are going to need to find a way to share it, and a sustainable and a just way to share it.
I love the way that you talk about the experiences intertwined and in so many challenging ways. I don't know if you both know the work of Dina Omar. She's a doctoral candidate in sociology at Yale, I think, but I met her when we were both in Berkeley, and I heard her, she's a poet, and I heard her reciting her poetry at a Palestinian rights demonstration at Stanford. And one of the poems is called June 5th, 2003, First Time Home. And in the end, she says, so I will dance, fight, yell, plead, kick, scream, read, write, sing, bleed, and love. I will love you into submission. I will love you like Mahmoud Darwish loved his people for our misery, because we are the same, dispossessed and exiled. I will love you like Moses loved his people to take them to the promised land, to part the Red Sea with his bare hands. I will love you, ultra-Orthodox Jewish man, head buried in the Torah, making love to the scriptures. I will love you, because we are both people of the sun, and I will love you, because remember, it is from my womb that new warriors are born. And that end of that poem is always just like, got me in the feels.
Do you have a link, or if you give us the name?
It's her, that book of poetry is hard to come by, because I think it was a small sort of self published volume, but her name is Dina Omar. And
Dina.
Yeah, and while you guys are talking in one of the next answers, I will find the link to where she recites it on a YouTube channel, because it's beautiful.
It is.
Yeah.
At our opening in Toronto, we had a beautiful Palestinian clarinetist play music while a very equally lovely poet read a poem by Mahmoud Darwish called Jerusalem, with very similar sentiments.
Actually, the clarinetist was Syrian. Jeff.
Syrian, right? He wasn't. He's Arab, but he was.
Back. Carmen, this event that Jeffrey mentioned, and you were invited to it. Of course, you couldn't be there. We had Jews, Zionists, Palestinians, Arabs, Muslim, Christians, over 100 of them in that room, all celebrating the message of our book, all standing behind it. We had music and poetry and food and drink, and we talked about the need to understand each other, and everybody left ecstatic, happy.
It's weird.
And then 5 days later, 6 days later, the world was turned on its head. And when people ask me, what hope do you have? I say, well, there was hope on October 1st, and there will be another October 1st, and another opportunity for us to try and do this again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I want to leave time for you guys to say anything that you would want to say to the United Church of Canada. I think that it's probably not news to either of you. We have long been accused by some parts of Jewish Canada as being anti-Semitic, in part because we had I think a general secretary or somebody decades ago who actually did say some things that were very anti-Semitic and supersessionist, and that sort of stuck. I have heard a lot of things that are supersessionist in the church, and I don't think it's because anybody in the United Church of Canada believes that Christians came to replace Jews, but it's such a long-standing tradition within Christian Zionism and Christian supersessionism and anti-Semitism within the Christian tradition that I think it's just almost like a blind spot for some folks without hearing it. And then we also have very deeply committed and experienced folks who engage regularly with Palestinian partners in the region over there, as you say in the book, and who also are brokenhearted. I don't think you can go to the Palestinian territories as an ecumenical accompanier and witness the daily violations of human rights and not come back with your own trauma about that experience. And so then I think it kind of like solidifies the us and them and the othering that happens, because you can't be there and not and go to the West Bank, or several folks, probably a couple on this call, have been to Gaza.
I put a lot of effort into our sauces. Crafting delicious flavors of real cheese, real cream,
That's okay.
making it real easy.
I sent you guys the link, and it just
tell people
launched
when
into
it's
the
up to you.
YouTube ads. So,
It's your fault. You put the link in
I
there.
know I did. I put the link there. You're probably not the only person that happened to on this call.
We asked you for the link and you gave it. So
Just everybody else was muted. That's all. We have this history of having some productive Jewish Christian dialogue in Canada that's largely broken down because of our debates that we've had internally within the church around what does a just peace look like. Do we support the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement or not? And we are not of one mind as a church on those issues.
Of course.
I think particularly because there are some folks that have resisted those binary dualisms historically, and there are some folks, we have people who are in the we can't do anything that could be possibly construed to be anti-Semitic because we don't ever want to replicate the Holocaust and the role that the church played in allowing the Holocaust in Germany and Eastern Europe. And then we have folks that are, coming from this deep commitment and solidarity with people in Palestine, especially when people have gone for come and see visits or things like that. And so if you had a word of encouragement to the church about what is the highest and best use of our advocacy and our internal dialogue, from a trauma-informed approach, what would that look like?
Well, so I'll start, I guess. He always says
that he takes the tough questions.
No, I'm always loath to give advice. So I'm going to share my perspective, as a Jew and someone who works in trauma, every day. Your truth needs to be guarded and protected, which means that we need to be very careful to not assail somebody who feels differently than we do. The question I'm constantly asking, and I work this through with Raja all the time. How do I stay in my space of empathizing for how traumatic anti-Semitism, three kinds, the historical anti-Semitism, the present anti-Semitism, and the fear of future anti-Semitism. Trauma has a future quality. Yeah. It is not just what happened, it's what's happening and what you fear will happen. An easy way to think about it is that trauma is not being in danger or being threatened. It's feeling that you are in danger or being threatened. And that's what I try to keep in mind when I hear what I perceive as deep overreactions about anti-Semitism. I try to keep in mind that it's fear-based. I know better. I say sometimes that you have to presume, in order to presume positive intent, you have to hallucinate to do so. So yes, at times, I know that there's a political agenda at play and it's not good trauma. But I stay in the trauma lane. So that's my first, I guess, word to you, is recognize that the reactions you're receiving are largely trauma-based. And if you can do that, you can detach a little bit. You still say your truth. Say what is right for you. Say what you feel your spiritual home, your spiritual center says. This is a lot of what I do as a Jew. I believe, first of all, in principles like tikkun olam, to heal the world, that's an action. That's not a word. That's something I have to do. I believe, in the freedom story we say at Pesach, that says, Passover, that because we were slaves and now are free, we have a duty to spread freedom wherever we go. So I keep the mission clear. I speak out about things that I think are wrong. And I still maintain empathy for those who say things that upset me, because I generally view it as a trauma response. That is the way I can maintain, even through some of these very troubled times in the last 8 weeks, when people have said some pretty awful things to us, certainly some Jewish colleagues to me. I have tried to stay centered in my message, which is I condemn violence. I speak for human life and dignity, and that the violence did not begin on October 7th. And if you want to solve this problem, you must realize that the actions of the last 75 years created the ground for Hamas. Hamas is a symptom. Hamas is not the disease. So I say that truth while maintaining empathy for how triggered my community feels. I can tell you that on October 7th, as illogical as it may sound, it was a rerun of the Holocaust for the vast majority of Jews. It literally, we were back in Auschwitz. And I know that probably makes no sense, 1,200 people versus 6 million, but I'm telling you that's how it felt. And it literally cut off this sort of, beautiful logic prefrontal cortex that allows us to think reasonably. And we just literally shot into our trauma tribal cave. And we're not out of it yet. We are stuck in it. I hope that helps.
It helps me. So listen, I mean, I'm going to talk. Jeff is talking at the human level. I'm going to talk about the political agendas, and these political agendas are very damaging to our society. When people conflate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, as has become a habit in the last 15, 20 years. The International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance produced a definition of anti-Semitism that does that. And when people make rules about what you can criticize and you cannot criticize about Israel, these are political agendas. And these political agendas, what they do is they may manipulate the trauma of their own communities, the historic fear and oppression of the Jewish people, and reignite those sentiments for the purpose of standing behind a political agenda. Israel is a state. It's a nuclear power. It does not need the city of Toronto or the premier of Ontario or of BC to say to protect it from criticism. And yet the political agenda was demanding institutions, all levels of government, to subscribe to that idea that the Holocaust Remembrance Alliance produced. These are divisive agendas. They are not good for even the Jewish community itself because they're manipulating the fear, they're keeping the fear alive. And we have now, regular folks seeing, a BDS sign and feeling threatened by it, BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions. A nonviolent movement was labeled anti-Semitic. So we have college students go to school and there's a desk with BDS. They've been told it's anti-Semitic, and people feel unsafe on campus, and they complain about anti-Semitism on campus. And now that's, again, I mean, they're not helping anyone but their own political agendas. And we as a society, need to stand up to those kinds of claims, because there is anti-Semitism. There is very real anti-Semitism. And it's not about Israel. Anti-Semitism is hatred of Jews, and it comes from the right. And it's alive and well in North America. So conflating, political positions with regards to Israel with real anti-Semitism does not help the Jewish community, does not help our social cohesion.
And it is stoking a lot of anger in the Palestinian community and the Palestinian supporter community. I mean, what we talk about in our book is that, just imagine feeling that knee on your neck and then being told that you can't actually express that upset about having the knee on your neck, that you're being hateful. I think that's a really, really important thing that we need to remember, that it is stoking more anger when a pro-Palestine rally in the city of Toronto or, in Edmonton or anywhere else, talks about the value of Palestinian life, even talks about the trigger term, talk about triggers, from the river to the sea, which is by a vast majority of Palestinians meant as equal rights for all between the Jordan River and and the Mediterranean Sea. And it was a phrase that was used by the founders of Israel from the very beginning, that the land of Israel would be a safe place for Jews between the river and the sea. When you have people manipulate that and say that's the killing of Jews, that's extremely harmful. And when you do, on occasion, have, and it's happened since October 7th, when you have Palestinians at rallies say things that cross the line into anti-Semitism, you need to speak out about it. You need to say that's wrong.
Yeah, I get the I'll close here and then I'll let folks raise their hands to ask questions. But I think the thing that was really helpful to me was when you used, I'm sorry, I've forgotten her name, but the Congresswoman from the United States, and how she like
Ilhan Omar.
Yeah, Ilhan Omar, and how she like fell into these anti-Semitic tropes that are also very real and present. And I think that you know, I mentioned earlier that I hear supersessionist things in the church all the time, and I think like, ooh, like we gotta educate ourselves about that, because you know, just like we don't just like we are trying to decolonize the way that we talk about the relationship between Indigenous peoples in Canada and non-Indigenous peoples in Canada. Like, we learn and change and grow and change our language, but if we don't actually take the time to understand like how words have been used and where there is still violent anti-Semitism in Canada, then we can, you know, it's hard to call it out too. So I like, you know, I feel like that's my responsibility. I feel very well versed in Palestinian perspectives on the struggle, and that's where my heart has been. And I feel a lot of affinity as an Indigenous woman in Canada, and you know, some of the conversations that I have with Palestinian theologians in the academy is around like where the lenses of settler colonialism sort of make sense, and hearing that it can't be only that, right? Like that's one particular way to look at at the conflict. But have I spent enough time like really understanding all of the ways that anti-Semitism manifests and what is happening for Jewish folks? I found I learned a lot from your book around, even as somebody who generally tries not to fall prey to binary dualisms, I still learned a lot in your book about how to avoid that. So I greatly appreciate it. Alan, do you want to maybe call on some folks to ask some questions of our authors?
Well, I can call them or you can call them. It's just as easy for you to call them. You don't need to include me in this gibberish.
Okay. I'm sure we have people. Joy, I see your name first. I think you'll have to activate your.
There we go.
There we go. There we go.
Classic mistake. I would like either Jeffrey or Raja to define Zionist and anti-Zionist, because these are terms that since I've been paying more attention than I had previously to the conflict, I'm not sure in what way they're being used. So, and I'm curious, because to me, the way it's coming across, and I may be misinterpreting this, is a Zionist is someone who believes in the right of the state of Israel to exist. And so, but yet Zionist is used, it seems to me, as a pejorative term. So I would like some clarification on that. Thank you.
A great question, Joy.
So, I mean, you know, like all questions, the answer is a little more complicated. But you know, let's start with this. So, if you go back, you know, to the origins of Zionism, late 19th century, there were really two streams of Zionism. One was a homeland for Jews, a place of safety that was seen primarily as a shared space with the people that were already there. There was also a second stream of Zionism, which is very similar to European colonialism. And you have to remember that the early Zionists were all white European men whose only model was European colonialism. So there were two real specific streams. One was more of a nation state stream, and the other was more of a, you know, a homeland for Jews that didn't necessarily require a Jewish majority. After 1917 in the Balfour Declaration, where Britain, you know, clearly said, we see a Jewish homeland in the land of historic Palestine, you know, and more Jews started coming from the pogroms of Eastern Europe, and then from other places, and then during the Holocaust, of course, and after very large migration. There were spats of violence all the way through the early and mid 20th century, because there really was a response and reaction to this feeling that Europeans were coming. They didn't really see them as Jews who were suffering. They saw them as people who were coming who didn't belong. And as has happened throughout history, they saw it as white men who had no reason or control of the land, to take out magic markers and divide up the territory in the way that they saw fit. So usually when somebody says they're a Zionist, they mean that Jews have the right to what is called self-determination. And that self-determination means a space in what most Jews see in various forms as Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, where Jews have a historic claim. There are huge varieties of this. There is religious Zionists that believe God gave them the land, and this is a God issue, and you can't argue with God. There are Zionists who are, who really believe that Zionism is a necessary project for Jewish safety. We actually say in the book from a film that the easy way to kind of think about Zionism and Palestine is that we jumped out of a burning building and we landed on somebody else's head. And this is a challenge. There are, what we call progressive Zionists that really fight for Palestinian rights in many ways, believe that the settlements are wrong, believe in ending the occupation. But we have seen, frankly, particularly since October 7th, that the trauma has limited that voice, that people who might normally occupy that lane have been much more about, no, we have to have Israel or we're going to die. So I think to people who see Zionism as solely as a settler colonial enterprise, absolutely see it as a negative. That it is seen as the same as I see Canada. That I am a settler on stolen land in Canada. That's how I see it. And I think many see Israel the same way. I think it's important to realize that for Jews, it's more complicated. It is absolutely settler colonialism and how it has affected Palestinians. But for most Jews, it is more about a reclamation project. It's more about a nationalist project than it is about taking from someone. Most would say that the taking was an unfortunate result of war, and we need to do something to make it better. I think that's enough, Raja, on Zionism 101.
I see Grant and Diane, so I'm assuming you're Diane that I can see in the picture, and then Diane Blanchard.
Excuse me. Yeah, it's Diane here, only here. I just wanted to say that I really learned quite a bit from this book about Palestine itself, because I think since I was born after the Second World War, immediately following, and I grew up in Winnipeg, which has a very strong Jewish sector when I was growing up. And so these terms like Holocaust and, anti-Semitism were used quite freely. But I think sometimes when I look back on it, my father was flight sergeant in bomber over Hamburg. And he had German background. I mean, his family had been in North America for a number of years. And he felt really badly that there were men, women, and children when he was bombing, because that's become a habit amongst many military, is to hide the weapons where the people are. And it's really hard to watch when I saw people being taken hostage and put underground underneath another military attack. And it just, I just got upset at that. It was the same thing almost. But those terms I heard more of, but I never heard much about Palestine itself. And so I'm very thankful. I know several people are thankful for this book, and I do want to thank both of you for it. And I didn't know what a kaffia was. I'd seen them, but I didn't know what it was, what the name was. And I don't know where the design comes from. I'm a graduate in clothing and textiles, so I'm interested in the design. I'm interested in the entertainment. I'm interested in people's culture, very much so. I want to say that I am also from one of those settler families that came so many years ago, but I now have an Indigenous daughter-in-law and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and I'm very proud of them. They're very beautiful children, and they give me a lot of pleasure at many times. Their other Kukum, their grandmother, died several years ago. So, and we were both interested in education. So we have certain values that sort of match, and we're able to do that. I have readily admitted, I think, or I come to admit that, yes, it was genocide. We didn't take care of Indigenous children in the residential schools in the way we should have. And when we were teaching them, we should have asked their parents in as well and learned some of the things that we could have learned together. I should tell you, however, that my family, my dad's family was not British, it was German Dutch. And they were part of the British Army, but the British leader was also married to the Mohawk chief's sister. There's a real, when I go back through that history, I just go, what on earth was going on then? And when I look back to the 60s, I don't think it was the way I was living it. I think there were other things going on. Winnipeg had names being changed to Métis names as well for Louis Riel's history, because Winnipeg is on Métis territory. So Highway 59 became La Jamodière Boulevard, his grandmother's name, you know, and now you just get used to it. It's sort of gradual. So when I look at people who are maybe intermarried between Jews and Palestinians, I can understand too that there's just times you sort of let some things roll off your back like a duck, water rolling off a duck's back, and then you just try and live the best way you know how. Yeah. Okay.
Diane,
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, Diane Blanchard, and then Shadia.
Can I just respond to?
Yeah, of course.
Well, thank you, Diane, for what you said, and two things I'd like to pick up on. I mean, it's first one is that, as you said, growing up in Winnipeg, you heard about the Holocaust and anti-Semitism and the Jewish experience, and it wasn't until you read our book that you learned something about Palestine. And of course, that's a main reason for the dichotomy we have here in North America in terms of how we see Palestinians and how we see Jews, is because we know one and we don't know the other. We know about the Holocaust, but we don't know about the Nakba. The Nakba is the catastrophe of 1948 that destroyed Palestinian society, and most of them became refugees. We think about Palestinians. We see Muslims. Some people think of ISIS and Al Qaeda, and of course, it has nothing to do with that. But Palestinians, Christian Palestinians, Muslim Christian Palestinians, many different persuasions of Palestinians are a nationalist project. It's not an Islamic one. Now, Hamas is an Islamist organization, and that's one of the main reasons I'm not a fan. But the thing is that we know one narrative much better than the other narrative here in North America. And that's why our natural reaction is sympathy for Israel and Jews, and not the other, the Arab, the Muslim, the brown person, and all that.
And I'm going to add a super short piece. You had said something, Diane, about hiding weapons to civilians. I just think it's really important to recognize that Gaza is a very, very densely populated small space, and I don't know where they would hide their weapons except where people are, because people are everywhere. And this is one of the things you hear over and over in the news. And if you know Gaza, it doesn't really make a lot of sense.
Thank you, Jeffrey. I see Diane, then Shadia, and then there's a question in the chat from Lorraine, and then Susan, and then Ian. And I'm going to see how it goes when we get to Ian. We might be out of time at that point, but I'll recognize those folks first.
Thank you for your book and for this conversation. I've met and have really appreciated the Christian Palestinians who live in Jerusalem and the West Bank, and who maintain a pacifist understanding that that's what Jesus taught us how to live, and that the West has invented just war strategies and justifications that they don't agree with. So I'm trying to imagine the kind of world that they live in and persist in, believing in possibilities and believing in human rights and believing in justice. And so I guess I hope that there could be a state where both peoples live together with justice and freedom. I wonder, for Jews, what the loss would be in trying to form a country, maybe not unlike Canada, where people don't have to be the same, but can live with respect for one another.
Well, I guess there are two, I know time is short, so I'm going to do a very short answer. Two short answers, I think, to that challenge. One is clearly just demographics. The fear for Jews is that in a single binational or one state solution, as it's called, their safety, which comes from a Jewish majority and from Jewish power, would diminish to the point where they wouldn't feel safe. It's saying it would, but I think that's the fear. And the second part is that we don't like to really name that Israel is not a democracy. It is an ethnocracy. It is built around one group of people at the expense of another group of people. And until that is recognized, and we have spoken for years in this way. We don't, Raj and I don't talk about peace. We talk about justice and we talk about reconciliation. And even progressives mostly talk about the occupation, which is 1967 forward. And the real beginning for Palestinians is 1948. And until the harm of 48 is recognized, I don't see a way forward. I don't mean to be a bearer of bad news, but that's how I feel.
Mm-hmm.
Raja, do you want to add anything?
No, let's take some more questions.
Okay. Thanks, Diane. Is it Shadia or Shadia?
Shadia, yes.
Shadia, okay.
Hello, everyone. I'm a Palestinian Christian, originally from Nazareth. Currently working in a local church in Vancouver. Carmen, we met earlier at the UST. I worked in faith-based peace building before coming here. I worked for 15 years trying to bring Israelis and Palestinians together based on the simple calling or simple mandate to love one another, be a good neighbor as a Christian. And one time I was at a meeting in Jerusalem, and I don't remember the context, but the person next to me, she was Palestinian, and she told me, "What do you do?" And I told her, like, I work for peace building, and through personal relationships, I help Israelis and Palestinians to see that they have a lot in common than they have different together. And I would love to hear your feedback, especially Rafiq, what would you have answered? And she told me, you shouldn't let Israelis be more than your occupier, because, right, there is that asymmetry or imbalance of power. And you cannot be an occupier and at the same time a liberator. So how do we navigate? Now, I understand narrative is a big issue, that there are difference of meta narratives in here, but how do we also come to terms to the imbalance of power, which also brings about why Israeli narrative is more known, is more accessible, more acknowledged than the Palestinian one. Yeah, and I mean, I don't know if you want, I can tell you what I answered, but I'd just love to hear what you would, like, how would you have approached that question?
And it's interesting. One of the surprises that I learned through my dialogue is that back when I lived in the Middle East, I was born and lived in Lebanon, and Israeli fighter jets would be flying over Lebanon all the time. We hear the sonic boom, and they always reminded us that they were there. Of course, Lebanon was invaded by Israel a number of times. And, I've always thought of Israel as this power that beat the Arabs and the Palestinians in every war, has nuclear weapons, the support of the United States, one of the most, strongest militaries in the world. And when I started talking to Jews here, I found out that they see it as this little tiny country, in a sea of Muslim, Arab, and Muslim countries, 50 plus of them Muslim countries, who go after Israel, every year at the UN, and they don't see it at all the way I saw it. They see it as facing an existential threat on a daily basis. I can't tell you how many times I've heard that. Israel faces an existential threat on a daily basis. And even here in North America, of course, there's that asymmetry in power also manifests itself here, because Jews are a much older community, much more established than Palestinian and Arab communities, and they have powerful organizations, advocacy groups, who have a lot of influence on the politics and the policy of the country. When I brought that up, the answer was, yeah, they misbehave sometimes. They go overboard and go on power trips, but we need them to protect us. So, one of the things you will gather from our book is the complete opposite views that each community has about every important subject that affects both of them.
Beautifully said. The only thing I'll add is that I think you were kind of framing around a normalization, which is often a very contested idea. How can you normalize with those that are oppressing you? And I think what is really important to Raja and I, to our work, is we get that over there. There's no reason for it over here. You're not normalizing the occupation. If you talk to a Jew over here, explain to them about your pain and what they can do to help you. That's not normalizing. That is deep conversation that may over time make a difference in how our governments act and how our society acts. So it's just very different over there than it is over here. We don't have bombs and rockets here. We have imported the violence in our language, and we've certainly seen that, in Technicolor since October 7th.
Thank you. So I had a question from Lorraine that came up before I saw Susan and Ian. And then there are a couple more that came in on the chat. So if we have time for those, I'll read those, but I'm not going to take any more hands raised. Many of my Jewish friends, this is from Lorraine Mackenzie Shepherd in Winnipeg. Many of my Jewish friends say that they are Zionist and pro-Palestinian and still support a two-state solution. Is this still possible? Is this a foil or a way forward?
Oh, you want me to try? Thanks, buddy. It always does this. I mean, this is a very real, and we know many people who believe that they hold these two things together and that they're harmonious. I'll say the things that I normally say to my Jewish, my community, who say these things, is that what is missing is not whether it's a one state or two state or any other solution, because that's not the business we're in. It's that those who say that they're for Palestinian rights and for Jewish rights and for a two-state solution have never explained to me what they're willing to give up to get it. And that's what's missing for me. So I don't know, I wouldn't say that it's just a foil. I would say that they believe it deeply, but I would say until you're willing, to put something on the line for it, it's just a talking point.
Yeah, I mean, every attempt since the Oslo process started 30 years ago at finding a two-state solution has failed, because the Israel, what was it was interesting to see how it was described at the time. Israel made a generous offer to the Palestinians, a generous offer to give them back their land, right? And not all of it, and not this and not that, and you cannot have an army, and we will continue to control your borders. And by the way, your airspace is probably something we will. So, my preferred option is one democratic state with equal rights for all. It's a bit of a far-fetched scenario to picture, especially after October 7. But the reality is that both Jews and Palestinians have an attachment to all of historic Palestine. They both want all of it. And the only way for both of them to have all of it is to share it together, all of it. But we'll see. I don't think it's going to happen in my lifetime.
And the only thing I'll add with the two-state solution question is just to realize, if we're being honest, that the land that was available to form a Palestinian state has largely been lost in the last 20 years, through settlement expansion, through the apartheid wall. So it's become a much, much more difficult problem, even if people are willing.
And the settler movement is so strong that, I cannot imagine any Israeli government would dare dismantle settlements.
Yeah. You make good points. Especially when the settlement is on top of a Palestinian home, which is something that happens frequently. I think sometimes we think of like settlements as being like neighborhoods, and there are whole neighborhoods, but they're also like you come home one day and somebody's built a house on top of your house. Okay, I see Susan and Ian. Maybe what I'll do, we have 5 minutes left. So maybe I'll ask you both to ask your questions, and then we'll give Jeffrey and Raja the last word.
Okay, first of all, I came to this book through a cookbook by Sami Tamimi, who you name in your book. And through that cookbook, I also found out about a Palestinian family, the Nasser family, the Tent of Nations. And it just drew me to want to read your book. So you make a good point in the book that things like cooking, which don't seem very political, draw people into being raise our consciousness. One of the questions I have is, how do you respond to these little videos that are the Palestinian-Israeli conflict in 5 minutes? And many of these, I have received some of them, and Christians perpetuate them. They seem, many, a lot of them just seem like propaganda. What can you say about that?
Okay, thanks. I'll let Ian ask his question and then let you guys respond.
Hi, thanks. Just a very short observation, I guess. Number one, thank you for your book. I'm only partway through it because I got hit with COVID for a while. I couldn't focus on anything for a while, but finally getting back to it in the next few days. But I just an observation about what you were saying, especially in your introduction about being attentive to the other. And it hit me not long after 9/11. I'd gone into a small Christian bookstore in the area where I was working to find something for some of my confirmation class. I'd never been in there before. And I finally, after browsing for a while, went up to the counter, and this gentleman was looking at me from behind the counter. And I happened to have my collar on, which was rare for me. Normally I wear my collar only going into an ICU in the hospital or whatever, or at church. And he looks at me and he's just staring at me, and I'm looking back at him, and he said, "What do you think about me?" And I said, "I'm sorry." He said, "I'm a Palestinian Christian, and this was just after 9/11. What do you think about me?" And it wasn't the fact that he was a Christian that he was concerned about, it was that he was Palestinian. And that to him, with my collar on, I represented the Judeo-Christian tradition. And I could see the pain in his eyes. I'm still choking up about it as I remember that. And I remember saying, "Can I reach across the counter and give you a hug?" And we did. And it just brought home that importance of being open to the other, with trying to put away any preconceptions or whatever. And I think the two of you are doing some tremendous work for that. And I thank you from the bottom of my heart. That's all I want to say.
Thanks, Ian.
Thanks, Ian. Yeah, I remember 9/11 very well. I was the president of the Canadian Arab Federation at the time, and all of a sudden I had to do a lot of learning about civil rights because if you were Muslim or Arab, the chances of your rights being violated was very high, back then, and a lot of people felt Arabs and Muslims, excluded in North America because of who they were. And that feeling came back after October 7th, when, they saw our politicians react so strongly about what happened on October 7th and looking the other way of what has been happening since October 7th. And the thousands and thousands of Palestinian civilian deaths. It's tough for Arabs and Muslims to be in North America sometimes. Not all the time, but sometimes, when we don't see ourselves represented in the decision making that's happening around us. When October 7th happened, there were all these demands of people to make a statement. Do you support Hamas? After 9/11, we faced the same question. Do you support Al Qaeda? Do you support what happened on September 11th? And these are nonsense questions. I mean, these are accusatory questions. You don't have to ask me that question. You shouldn't have to ask me that question. About the 5-minute videos, if it feels like propaganda, it probably is. And I can't see how a 5-minute video is going to give you a lot of information about a history that started in 1917 with the Balfour Declaration.
I think the only thing I'll add is that, we often refer to, recognizing that sometimes we call them blind spots. Isn't really a great phrase, but we sometimes say things we can't see or blind spots. I hope that we walk away remembering that what we actually have is vision spots. We see very little. Most of the big truth is hidden from us. And the only way to bring it out of hiding is to start to recognize what you don't know, you don't know. This is not something we do well. It's not something our brain does well. It often feels very threatening. But if you start every conversation with somebody new to you, assuming that most of their experience is outside of your viewpoint, you will have a rich conversation.
I love that. Wise words. There's so many other comments and questions that came in on the chat after I sort of called time on questions, but I'll just share them with you, and then maybe we can continue to have conversation, and I can post them on my Facebook page or whatever. But our former moderator, Marion Party, said, as a United Church person, I feel chastised and challenged by your extremely helpful book. The chastisement is related to the fact that when we speak, we tend to side with one narrative or the other. My question is, what might our statements to government, etc., look like if we spoke out of the perspective that both the Jewish and Palestinian narratives are intertwined? Marion, you had a much more concise way to ask something that I had tried to ask earlier. Somebody else, Sandra, said, thank you, Raja and Jeffrey, for your book and the opportunity to meet and learn from you during this extremely difficult time. Your words about trauma and your advice on how to speak to those who are in that place are so helpful. They help me to understand how love and justice have to walk hand in hand to have peace. Janet said, I echo the gratitude for this opportunity to listen and to learn. Thank you for your presence and your book. Mary Royal Duzek, I found the book very helpful as someone who strongly supports Palestine. It was an aha for me to understand just how terrified Jewish people are of another Holocaust. I always thought that was hyperbole. I did not understand the role that plays. I think that was my big takeaway too, Mary. Thank you for the discussion. Thank you to Raja and Jeffrey for your openness and grace on a sometimes always difficult topic. And then Samia said, thank you for your tears. Thank you, Ian. I remember this feeling deeply as a Palestinian Christian and United Church music director. And then just more thank you from several people. So I cannot thank you enough for taking the time to join me. I know that your book tour probably expanded in scope significantly over the last couple of months. And I feel grateful that we planned this early, and also know that in addition to starting your days with the sentence, I'm really not okay, that you are also building resilience and are providing a huge service to communities across North America by having these conversations with us. And so just so much gratitude for both writing the book and then for continuing to speak out about it at a time when it's especially difficult. So Wallace Gaiasachet to both of you, and safe travels this weekend as you visit the Kootenays.
Thank you. Thank you for having us, Carmen.
Thank you very much.
For those of you who, oh, sorry.
Just want to thank everybody for, for their interest and for coming and learning.
And the feedback we're hearing is really very, very important to us. We need to know how people are reacting to our message, and you are letting us know, and we need that. So thank you for that.
If anybody has subsequent thoughts or wants to share feedback directly with Raja or Jeffrey, you can send it to me at moderator@united-church.ca, and I'd be happy to forward it to them for you. For those of you who are regular participants in the Mod Squad Book Club, we are taking a break for December, knowing that folks are busy with Advent and Christmas, and we will be back on January 24th, I think. It's in the ChurchX platform. We're reading The Long Road Home by Deborah Thompson, who is a professor of race studies in Montreal, and I'm very, very excited to read her book. I know many people have been living into our commitment to become an anti-racist church, and reading a lot of critical race theory and how to be an anti-racist, white fragility. And a lot of those books are written from an American perspective. And the reason why I chose Deborah's book is she's a Black Canadian woman who has been here her family has been in Canada for hundreds of years. Grew up as the only one, being often the only Black person in her social circles, then taught and did her postdoc in the United States, and then came back to Canada. And for me, her book is a memoir, and it's written in a way that sort of takes the discourse that is happening and is very rich around anti-Black racism in the US, and then translates it into a Canadian context in a way that I find really helpful. So I hope that you'll join us for that book in January. Once again, thank you to Jeffrey and to Raja for joining us tonight. Thank you to Alan for always making sure our tech stuff moves smoothly. And we'll see you in the new year. And Advent and Christmas blessings to you all. And also to anybody, including Jeffrey and Raja, if you celebrate, have other holy holidays coming up, happy holidays to you too.